Right. Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And here we go. So this coming Shabbat, our Parsha is Ekev. And last Shabbat with Parshat Ve'et Hanan, of course, we had two very important sources, the first paragraph of the Shema and also the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. Uh, in order to, I think, let us down gently, this Parsha of Ekev has one significant, very significant passage, and that is the second paragraph of the Shema, which eventually you will come across, but that's in this particular section here. And here, of course, Moses is trying his best to encourage the Israelites because he knows his days are exceedingly numbered at this point, and he so wants the Israelites to be able to prosper and do well, and he understands that they can only do that if they fulfill God's will, if they're able to curb their own wills into the divine will and to find a place in this land of Israel where there are certainly commandments that apply only to the land of Israel, and so that the land of Israel becomes a place where the Israelites can now practice in a fuller kind of way the divine will. And I think that trying to understand this concept of divine will from a universal point of view, trying to see how it is to somehow synchronize and synthesize our lives with the universe itself is a grand ideal for us, which, of course, our religion tries to actually put feet to, so that it actually isn't just an idealistic thing, but actually is something that becomes a part of our lives and becomes internalized. And so Moses is going to emphasize the importance of this. So Lishmor, right? So he goes we sort of catching things in the middle of it. So I may go back one verse to see if that's a good place. Okay, here we go. Look at this. Va'ata Yisrael, and now Israel. Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imcha. What does the Lord your God request of you, or require of you, or ask of you? Ki im liyira et Adonai Elohecha, except to only to fear the Lord your God. And I think that, in this particular context, the idea of fearing is to take seriously. In other words, to understand, to deeply, deeply understand how powerful and how great God is, and that influence on our lives, and how our lives are so at the whim of this great, great, great being here. So I think that's involved in terms of fearing, but also simply taking it seriously. Lalechet, and positively, lalechet, to go, to walk, bechol drachav, in all his paths, ula'ahva oto, and to love him, ula'avod et Hashem Elokecha, and to serve the Lord your God, v'chol levavcha, with your entire heart, uv'chol nafshecha, and with your entire soul. In other words, with your entire being. And that's, we're going on now. Lishmor et mitzvot Hashem, to guard the commandments of the Lord, ve'et chukotav, and his decrees. So again, lishmor, right, to actually guard them, to actually be doing them, right? Unfortunately, it seems that it's so easy to just slip into it, to seeing these things as idealistic, but not trying to actually ground them in our lives, right? So he's dealing with this. I mean, this is human nature. Nothing has changed that much in terms of human nature. Asher anochi metzavcha hayom, which I command you today. See if there's another sentence before we go on. Yes, letov lacha, for your own benefit. Right? That's the point. Lishmor et mitzvot Hashem, right? To guard the commandments of the Lord. Va'af hi lo lechinam. And this too is not for no purpose. It's not just gratuitous. Ela letov lachem, but for your benefit, shetikablu schar, because you will be rewarded. So I know that ideally we shouldn't be performing mitzvahs because we are benefiting from them. But on the other hand, there's a good chance that if we don't sense that there's any reward for them, we won't bother. And the truth is, of course, we know that to such a great extent, mitzvot are not, in fact, followed. And so at least having a reward, if you're doing a mitzvah for a reward, at least you're doing the mitzvah. And then, of course, eventually, when you start it, and there's a statement, I believe, in Pirkei Avot that says, "Shelo lishma, ba lishma," which means if you practice these things in order to gain a reward, eventually you'll come to do them without any expectation of a reward. But there is a reward, regardless. Hein Hashem Elokecha Hashamayim Ushmayim. Indeed, to the Lord your God are the heavens and the heaven of heavens. Right? Everything, in other words, right? Haaretz, the land, the earth, the Chol Asher Ba, and all which it contains. Ein Lashem Elokecha. So again, you think of how Moses is developing his argument and his, in order to help us understand this better. Hakol, right? Everything, everything. For afal pichein, but nevertheless, the Rashi is pulling out the contrast that's going to come about that Moses is actually trying to make. That despite the fact that God actually owns everything, everything belongs to God. Rak ba'avotecha chashak Hashem milak kol. He's going to go on, Moses is going to go on to say, however, only in your ancestors, in other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did the Lord elect from everything. That special relationship that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had, in that they accepted God as their personal Lord. And that's sort of a way to summarize what our relationship is to the commandments, if in fact we decide we're going to perform them. So you're going to see, right? Rak ba'avotecha chashak Hashem la'ava otam. In other words, despite this, only in your forefathers did the Lord desire, right, or elect to love them. Vayivcha v'zaram acharehem, and he chose their seed, their descendants after them. Bachem mikol hamim, right, amongst you from all the nations, kayom hazeh, like this particular day, as on this day. So, part of it is, that God chose the Jewish people. This is, of course, the notion of the Jewish people, but it still is, there is a anticipation there, but nevertheless, it's still up to the Jewish people to accept, love is a two-way street. And the point is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and when I say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I know I want to say this, that we're talking about them as the heads of their families. That's not to discount their families, their wives, etc. Right? But regardless, we're trying to emphasize that special relationship that they had with God, that they made God their Elohim, and that was so powerful. Their devotion was so powerful that God, as a reward to them, basically made this promise to all their ancestors following them throughout the generations. So, so Bachem, amongst you, kamo she'atem, right? So, and I'm looking at this. Okay, so I think it goes on here. Okay, so kamor means like, as sha'atim, you ro'im etchem, okay, or you are to be seen. Well, I think this is a different, instead of kamo sha'atem, it says ro'im etchem, one is to be viewed chashukim, as desirable, as elected, mikol ha'ovdei kochavim, from all the idolaters, hayom hazeh, today. So the idea of following idols. Keep going. Umaltem et orlat levavchem. Look at this. And you shall circumcise the foreskins of your hearts. Right? When one's emotions, move one away from serving God. And yes, I think when we're talking about love, we're certainly talking about a feeling and an emotional sense. But it also occurs to me that one has to be extremely mindful and thoughtful, and to somehow combine a realization of the nature of what it is to be a human being, and also to be a Jew, and also to be part of this universe in the presence of the divine. So you have to get rid of something. You have to get rid of the stubbornness. The orpechem, and the orif is that back, the nape of the neck. Lo takshuod, you shall not harden anymore. Right? In other words, the idea of the Jewish people being stiff-necked, that particular metaphor. And as I've explained, that has to do a comparison with an ox, and that's why we talk about the yoke of the covenant, of the commandments, excuse me, because you have to use a yoke, and the way in which a yoke operates, because the neck of an ox is stiff, it's hard to move. So this idea of the fact that every one of us has this sense of stubbornness, more or less, but the idea is that in overcoming that stubbornness and in being able to do that, there is great reward in that. That then, in some ways, of course, it's that very thing that gives us purpose in this life. Let's take a look. Orlat levavchem, the the foreskin of your hearts, literally. He says, Otem levavchem, right? We're talking about, I believe this is, let me make sure yes, Otem levavchem, the obstruction of your hearts, the kisuyo, and its covering. In other words, where, again, this has to do with stubborn feelings and a sense of where your feelings can take you. Remember what I said, right? The Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally. But it's that very ability that we have as human beings to do that gives us dignity. Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei Elohim. For the Lord your God is the God of all gods. Adonai Hadonim, and the Lord of all lords, Ha'el Hagadol, the Hagibor Vanora. There you can see that phrase that we use in our own Sidur, right? The great, the mighty, the awesome God. Asher lo yisafanim, who does not show favoritism, but lo yikach shochad, and will not accept a bribe. That God is that true judge. V'Adonai ha'adonim, right? The Lord of lords. Lo yuchal shum adon. There is not a single Lord. L'hatzil etchem yado. There is no other Lord that can save you from his hand, literally, his power, his control. So you can see there's some basic fundamental ideas and beliefs that Moses is sharing with the Jewish people. Lo yisapanim, literally it means he will not lift up his face. But what it means, or lift up face a face or faces. Regardless, it has to do with showing favoritism. Im tifriku or lo. But the point is, haven't we just read how God has favored the patriarchs and their descendants? So I think Rashi is feeling a little bit of a contradiction here. So he goes on to say, Im tifriku olo. In other words, he's not going to show you favoritism if you cast off his yoke. So don't expect special treatment if you decide to reject God. So that's how Rashi harmonizes the possible contradiction in what we've just read. Lo yikach shochad, and he will not take a bribe, lefaiso b'mamon, to appease him through money, right, with some kind of gift like that. And of course, we know that even probably to this very day, there are people who will act in a terrible kind of way, but make large donations to religious institutions and somehow feel that that justifies their behavior and that they're going to get off with it. So here you can see that Moses is already anticipating that kind of possibility and that kind of behavior. Oseh mishpat yatom v'amana, who does justice for the orphan and the widow, for ohev ger, and loves the stranger, latet lo lechem v'sima, to give him bread and clothing. So it's interesting, right? The ger is the person from outside the Israelite community, from outside the Jewish community, and saying that God loves people who, despite the fact that they were not initially born as part of the Jewish community, choose to come and associate with it. Right. So, but the specifics here, yeah, Lauren.
So he is just talking about like converts as opposed to strangers that didn't become Jewish.
Well, there were within rabbinic Judaism, there were different kinds of converts. They sort of saw essentially the act of conversion is belief in one God and one ultimate divine, powerful, ultimately powerful one, who, you know, um, controlling the world, right? That transcended the acceptance of that. So they talk about someone who accepts that, but still, doesn't keep kosher and doesn't necessarily accept all the mitzvot. Whether or not the Shabbat would be included, I am not certain. It's occurring to me only because the Shabbat is our manifest acceptance. It's the way in which we show our belief in God. And that's that idea that if we really, really do believe in God, then observing the Shabbat is a way of declaring that and giving witness to it, such is why the Shabbat becomes so fundamental in terms of the Ten Commandments and things like that. So I think that the expression that comes to mind has more to do with the fact that this particular individual, while they accept the notion of this one transcendent being, nevertheless, and probably keeps Shabbat as well. Nevertheless, doesn't perform all the other mitzvahs, and specifically what's mentioned, as I recollect, is keeping kosher. But on the other hand, there are people who are ger tzedek, right? They have a person who is a ger 100%. Yes.
And the orphan and the widow. So the orphan,
Mhm.
I assume, is a minor,
Yes.
and the
Basically,
orphan, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say it. Yeah, I mean that's definitely referring to them, but I would think that an orphan might also be someone who has no longer a family to support them. You know what I mean? Who in some ways is like an orphan, but I think you are talking about a minor. Yes,
But you're also talking about Jewish orphans and widows.
yes. I think we are here, but I'm not sure. It doesn't say that, you know. It just says the orphan and the widow, and I think you bring up a very interesting point that in general God has, we believe in a universal God, and that means that God does care about. There's no reason why a God would not care for any orphan and widow, that basically lived an ethical life, and wasn't doing things that just really, rock the commandments to their core. So we'll see where Rashi goes with it. Well, we haven't had a look at it yet. So let's take a look, because I think he draws some very important points from this, right? So Oseh Mishpat Yatom V'Amana, who takes up the cause, right? The just cause of the orphan and the widow. Hare Gvura, this is so beautiful, this particular concept, right? Hare Gvura, it, here is God's um, greatness and power, right? We've just talked about God being the God of all gods and God of the heavens, that God is, etc. The Eitzel Gvurato, and right next to this description of God's power and greatness, right? Atam Motse in Vatnuto, you also discover God's humility. So this whole idea, and we see this particular style in elsewhere, like in the Psalms, that we say, some of the Psalms show this, where you take on the one hand God's incredible power, etc., and majesty, and at the same time talk about how God takes care of the people that are oppressed, etc., etc. So that's part of what Rashi is bringing out here. So that's, and he's quoting from the tractate Megillah in the Torah. Ve'ohev ger latet lo lechem v'sima, and who loves the stranger to give him bread and clothing. V'davar hashuv hu zeh, right? And he says, this is something extremely important. Shekol atzmo shel Yaakov Avinu, right? That with all, I think what he's saying is that Jacob, our father, right? Uh, everything that the most important thing to him, al zehit palel. This is what he prayed for when Jacob was praying to God. He prayed to him, "V'natan li lechem le'echol," who will give me bread to eat, u'veged lilbosh, and clothing to wear. So it's such a beautiful, literary reference to that story in Genesis, where Jacob sees the ladder of and the angels going up and down, and God speaks to him there, and this is what Jacob says, that I will do this, I will, even away from my home, etc., etc., if you will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear. So,
Eh,
yeah, go ahead.
well, both of those things, food and clothing,
I know.
were used in his conflict with Esau when Esau
Yes.
wanted the food, when
Hmm.
he put on the clothing to make
Isn't
himself
that
feel like
interesting?
Esau's, furry
Right,
skin,
right, like,
and
yeah,
then the clothing that then the skin that his uh
right,
brothers, something that his
right,
brothers brought back to prove that, but the other thing is, as far as God clothing and feeding people and taking care of the oppressed, of
yes,
course, that doesn't happen. So if the point is that God provides and it's up to human beings to distribute,
yeah, yeah. I
either
mean,
way, how can you say that the hungry are being fed or the oppressed are being taken care of and clothed when
okay.
they're clearly not?
Right. Okay. So here's the thing. Is it saying every single person, right? It is just saying that in general, I think part of what it's saying is that there are many cases where there are people who are in fact in this situation and are being taken care of, right? And and also that it is for us that the point being made here is how important it is for us to do this, that when we make sure that the underprivileged are given adequate food and adequate clothing, that we're actually doing divine work. that is something that is so, so, so important, right? I mean, I don't think that he's necessarily trying to give a philosophical, or theological argument here, but I think he's also talking to such a great extent where, in fact, there are so many who are, in fact, taken care of. So
Um, yeah, I'm not sure what the statistics are in terms of people who are not taken care of, and with the probably millions involved in
there may be,
wars
there
and
may be,
famines, and
yeah,
not just soldiers and victims, but their families. There's just so much.
I know. Well, a couple of things. One is to understand that, if it weren't for God, the food wouldn't grow and we wouldn't have the intelligence to make clothing and also, provide the natural materials, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, I think the point that he's making here is perhaps saying that when we do this, that the real point he's trying to make is that when we do this, when we do take care of the orphan and the widow, God takes note of it, and that we are in fact doing God's work when we do that, and to understand that that's important. That God isn't only concerned about the movement of the planets and the universe, and the stars, etc., but that God is also concerned about these very, humble kinds of things. I think that's the point he's trying to make, because like what you said, of course, has always been true, and the point you're making, of course, is absolutely valid. There sadly are, you know, millions of people who are, underfed and underclothed, et cetera, et cetera. But I think he's trying to say, that those are important things to God to make sure that these things are done. Okay. So, um, and of course, if we do it, we again are doing it because God makes us capable of doing it, because we're in a position to do it. And we know the prophets, speak about this. So in some ways, I think what you're bringing out is the fact of how intimately connected our own behavior is in terms of how we can represent the divine presence in this world. And of course, I believe that. I believe that the temple really is a model for every single individual, to say that every single one of us is extremely significant in our ability to bring in the divine presence. Every single one of us is capable of doing this. And one of those ways is making sure that that underprivileged people are not suffering. That's divine work. So that's how I would understand these passages. Look at what he's going to say. V'ahavtem et hager, and you shall love the stranger. Ki gerim heitim, because you yourselves were strangers, be'eretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt. So there we are, right? I mean, that's exactly the point he's leading to, right? Ki gerim heitim. Don't forget your own origins, right? Mum shebecha, the blemish that is in you. Al tomar lechavecha. Don't accuse your fellow of the very blemish you have. And of course, sadly, I think that's a temptation sometimes, to see the faults of others and ignore the faults of one's own. So it's just a very human kind of thing. Let me go on a little bit. Let's see. Should we? There are a few more verses, and we actually are out of time. So please God, we will continue tomorrow. So I'll stop here, and we'll. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Sorry. Gosh. Okay. All right. I'm gonna get back to the meeting. I'm gonna stop the share.
This on here. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, we were created in the image of God. Shalom Elohim. So we were created in the image of God, and He gave us a Torah, and He gave us a Torah. So it's His Torah, and it's our Torah. The same thing. So if we have to abide. We we are doing what He created us for, because we were created in His image.
Right. So my understanding, of course, of I think that's part of it, right? That perhaps when it talks about us being created in God's image is the point I think you're making, Mitchell, which is that by being created in God's image, we are capable of bringing that divine presence into the world. That's
Right,
in fact the important thing. And of course, the perhaps the simpler message is to recognize how you want to treat another person. That when you
right,
wrong another person, you're
right,
wronging God, right? And
right,
that's perhaps the
right,
most direct
right,
meaning of this.
right,
Uh,
right, right.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Uh,
you.
all
Thank you.
right. Going to stop the recording.